Pleasure to see you here on this lovely day as we continue our journey through Egypt, especially ancient Egypt. Our journey began last Thursday evening, and we are now in, I think, our fifth session, and many of you have been here for the entire series, and we appreciate that. Others, if this is your first, make sure you have a program which is provided at the back of the room so that you can join us for subsequent activities that go on until the first part of November. So without further ado, I will introduce Wafiq Wabi, the coordinator of this series.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming to this session of the symposium. And I can understand what runs in your minds and hearts, what brought you to this session. Being born and raised in Egypt, I'm so anxious to see what Dean Bonnie Irwin will tell us about the myths of Egypt. So how about you? Anybody born and raised in Egypt other than myself? Okay. Ancient Egypt, yes. Well, I had a hard time finding words to introduce Dean Bonnie Irwin. And I said, this fits. No, it doesn't do justice to her. And tried to find and find and find. And then I came up with 6 words. But I'm going to tell you this story about her before I give the 6 words of introduction. She is one of the very few, maybe one of a kind, that can stand or sit in front of an audience like this and hold a pen like this in her hand and capture the attention and stimulate the mind of the audiences for 45 minutes non-stop. And don't tell me that they were sleeping or something, because I looked at their eyes and they were just captured. She just simply talked about technology and writing and the English language in the symposium about technology and us a few years ago. I was really, what do you say, mesmerized in English or what? Is this a good word? Is it a good word? Okay. So I am looking forward to her presentation today. And here are my 6 words of introduction. Here she is, Dean Bonnie Irwin.
Well, and for those of you who don't know Dr. Wabi, he is someone to whom I cannot say no, which is probably more the reason I'm here today. While I know a whole lot about writing and how it changed our world, and while I know a whole lot about myth, I know very little about ancient Egypt. So I'm just going to put that out there right now. We do have some folks in the audience, I think, who know quite a bit more about ancient Egypt than I do. And so I'm hoping that we can generate a conversation eventually. But I do want to talk a little bit about what we know and what we don't know about the myths of ancient Egypt. And one of the things I'd start with is there's probably a whole lot more that we don't know than we know, although we know a lot more than we did 100 years ago. So that's where we are today. With my literature class this week, we are reading Ovid's Metamorphoses. Ovid was a Roman writer who recaptured Greek and Roman mythology in a series of kind of amusing anecdotes. And one of the stories he tells is the story of Phaethon. Phaethon is the son of the sun, Apollo, and one day he really wants to drive his father's chariot, which is the sun that goes over the horizon. And so Phaethon's father, Apollo, does something that no parent should ever do. Before he hears the question, he says, anything you want. And so when the young man says, I want to drive the chariot, he has no choice but to say no. The reason I'm telling you this story is it's really quite funny and tragic at the same time, the way Ovid tells it. But near the end, as Phaethon is driving the chariot, which is the sun for this particular story, and he loses control. And so imagine, if you will, that you are a human being walking the face of the earth, and all of a sudden the sun is just racing all around the sky. You see it, you don't see it, it has no pattern, it's going really fast. Well, one of the things that supposedly happens in the aftermath of Phaethon driving this chariot is that he gets too close to the earth in Africa. And when he does, African people turn darker than the people in Europe. And also the Nile is boiling, and she's fearing for her life, and so she goes and hides. And this is their way of explaining the fact that we don't know where the source of the Nile was. At least we didn't in ancient Rome. But so there's this whole narrative that explains all these different things. And that's one thing that myth attempts to do, is explain those things that we don't have easy answers for. So if you don't know where the river Nile begins, here's one reason why. It used to be there, but it ran away. All right. Now, Egyptian myth isn't quite this lighthearted. Most myths are not. Ovid likes to twist them in his telling of them. But what myths are, by a scholarly definition, are sacred stories. They are stories that typically deal with gods, supernatural phenomena, and are believed by the people who tell them to be true. But truth is a pretty broad concept. Does it mean that all the little details were believed? Probably not. And when I start telling you this one myth from Egypt, I think you're going to realize that there are probably some things here that people didn't literally think happened, but they represent larger phenomena. They represent basic truths. So they're true to that extent. So by this definition, for example, the Bible is a myth. And when I go into a mythology class and say that, many times students take offense because they think I'm saying that it's not true. I said, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it is a group of sacred stories told by people who believe in the truth of those words. But they are stories. They are the creation of human beings. So some myths about myth, and in particular Egyptian myth. One is that there is, and obviously I'm using myth in two ways here, right? There is one myth that tells the whole story of Egypt. I mean, you cannot in most cultures point to a single myth and say, this explains it all. Okay, and Egypt is also like that. There are so many stories. There are hundreds of them. Ancient Egyptians believe their myths literally. Again, probably not. The Egyptian gods are just like the Greek gods. Well, in some ways, there are many of them, but they don't represent particular things the way the Greek gods and goddesses do. I mean, Greek mythology, for example, you've got a god of love, you've got a goddess who represents the earth, you have all these different ones, and some of those are there in Egyptian mythology, but it's much more fluid. Here's an interesting one that kind of goes back and forth, I think. Goddesses are less powerful in Egypt than God. This again becomes a matter of semantics. What do you mean by power? Because there are some very powerful female figures. They're not necessarily in charge, but they exert tremendous power in the story. Egyptian creation myths are all of one type, and I'll talk about different types of creation myths here in a moment. That's also not the case. Egyptian gods were all-powerful, perfect beings, the way a Judeo-Christian culture would identify with a god. Certainly not. They have their flaws. Perhaps not as flawed as some of the stories we hear about the Greek gods and goddesses, but flawed nevertheless. And it would also be a myth to conclude that these myth traditions were stable over time. We're talking about a history of stories that goes thousands and thousands of years, and anytime you have a story like that, it's going to change. It's not as simple as the game telephone, which is the conclusion we always sort of come to. It's like, well, they were in an oral tradition before they were ever written down, therefore they're going to change all the time. The fact is that's not the case. They change very slowly, but they do change. And identities change, particular themes morph into other themes, but there are probably some basic truths that remain constant. Okay. So when we look at myth, the primary type of myth that many people study are creation myths, because every culture wants to know where they came from. And while evolution answers the question of how a human being got to be a human being, a lot of people find it unsatisfactory because it doesn't say why. What are we doing here? What is the point of human existence? Now, from a biological perspective, again, we can define that as to perpetuate our species, as all those things. But what is really the purpose of being a human being on Earth? All cultures seek to answer that question. And in trying to answer that question, they come up with different stories and different versions of how the world came to be. These tend to fall into three major categories. One is the God speaks or thinks, and having done that, something is created. So for example, let there be light in the book of Genesis, and there was. Right? This is an example of a God just sort of speaking light into existence. Or in the New Testament, and the Word was God. Right? Words of gods are very powerful, and sometimes that's all it takes. Or even a God can just think a thought, and all of a sudden something will appear. Okay, that's one way of explaining how things are created. Another one is that creation was a manual process, that a God or powerful creator being took some substance and shaped it into something. If we look at Native American myth, for example, there's lots of stories of a creator being taking something like clay and forming it into human beings or into coyote or into some other thing. And if you think about this, as you're trying to figure out how anything came into being, we know if we speak or we think, sometimes things happen as a result of that. So that is a logical way to think about how creation takes place. We always make things with our hands. That's another logical way to think for things to be made. Think, what is the other one? What's the one that I haven't mentioned? It's the reason we're all here, right? That there is some kind of, and I'm going to expand that because it's not always sex. It's some kind of bodily function, because we have some gods in some cultures who are regurgitating the world or producing the world through other means. But the idea is it is some physical human function. For a long time, some of these were pushed to the side because early myth scholars didn't really want to think about some of the things that ancient cultures were pretty open about, that later societies have not been. And so the interesting thing about some of the Egyptian myths is that all of these things are present. The creation is taking place in all of these different ways. And in that respect, Egyptian myths are somewhat unique. I'm not saying that's not the case ever in other cultures, but the fact that we have all three in some very short stories is really interesting. Okay. Some of the challenges of studying Egyptian myth, and if you've been coming to some of the other talks, you know what some of those challenges are, and that begins with language. It took a really long time for anyone to figure out what hieroglyphics meant, and the combination of the hieroglyphics that represent sound versus a symbol that might represent a particular god or an animal, and they're all mixed together and they're carved in stone, or they're written on papyrus. The ones written on papyrus didn't last quite as long as some of the ones on stone. So we have pieces, lots of little pieces of things in many, many different languages. In those languages take different forms depending on how old it is. So imagine, if you will, trying to figure out what is the creation story of Egypt, and you see this whole array of things. Archaeologists, historians, literary scholars, language scholars had to work for centuries to figure all of this out, and I would argue that we still don't have all the answers that we might like to have. All right. And this is just what we have in writing. What the stories were before they were committed to stone or papyrus is another topic entirely. And that went on for who knows how long, but at least 1,000 years before anything was ever committed to writing. So then when you try to speculate on what an ancient Egyptian, say from 4000 BC, might have believed, it's nearly impossible, which is one of the few things that gave me the courage to actually talk about this. Because, like, well, nobody really knows much of anything, so I can speculate with the best of them. I'm not just trying to say that we don't know anything, because we do know quite a bit. Also, because so much of Egyptian mythology appears in artwork, so some of the stories are told by sculpture, or again, being carved on the side of a tomb, we have pieces of a story. We don't have a nice long narrative that's bound up in a pretty book that we can just read. All right. There never was anything that resembles a Bible or a Quran for ancient Egypt. There were hundreds of little pieces of little stories, and what we can do is cobble those together and kind of figure some things out. The other language challenge we have are the names. There were myths in all areas of Egypt. Just anytime there are human beings who tell stories, there are going to be stories about how we came to be. Lots of different languages in what we now call Egypt. 3 major cities, fairly close to the north, all along the Nile, each of which had their own myth tradition. The story remains fairly consistent, but the names change a little bit, which adds another level. So here's an outline of a version of creation according to the Egyptians. First, there was water. This is pretty common. We see this around the world. A lot of creation myths start with a watery chaos. All right. Then a creator appears. Now, if you're in Thebes in ancient Egypt, you call this creator being Amun or Amun-Ra. If you are in Heliopolis, which was what is now Cairo, or at least a piece of it, Atun or Atun-Ra, and those obviously are connected to each other. Those names are too similar to be totally disconnected. But then if we go to Memphis, which is a little bit further south or up the Nile River, we have Ptah, completely different consonants in a very different conglomeration, but it plays pretty much the same role. So this creator god creates some land in the middle of the watery chaos, generally referred to as a mound of land. But imagine any continent, anything. So a piece of land gets created. Why? Well, we know people live on land. They don't live in the water. And so if we're going to get to explain where we are today, that's how we have to get there. Then we see the sun. The sun comes out. There's emergence of a sun, the first sunrise. The sun makes an appearance. The sun god is threatened by forces of chaos and loses an eye. In some versions, loses his daughter. But he loses something. Most versions will argue it's an eye. And living beings are created either by the hands of the creator, the thoughts of the creator, or by bodily fluids of the creator. And I'll give you some specific examples. So there are various ways of describing the actual act of creation itself. And this is how the world and living things were created, but then many of the myths tell us that human beings were created from the tears of this creator god. Someone goes in search, and any number of characters goes in search of the missing eye and finds it. Meanwhile, the god has created himself a new eye, and so he's got 2 eyes again, and his old eye is upset because it no longer has a home, and it starts to cry, and these tears become human beings. Okay, this is a version. Right. And that's kind of interesting. Human beings are made up of 96% water. An ancient Egyptian probably couldn't give you that precise percentage, but they know that we're a very liquid species. And you also think about the fact that human beings are very emotional, and we weep. Why not a tear, as opposed to anything else, really? Okay. So we then have 2 godlike beings. One represents air and sunlight in many versions, and the other is that character's sister, 2 female characters that descend from this original creator god. And then the next generation is Geb, which is the earth, and Nut, which is the sky. There is often in a creation story that describes the creation of the whole world a moment when the earth and the sky separated. It's hard for us in this day and age to imagine what it would have been like before they were separated and what does that mean, but there is a moment where people recognize the earth and the sky are 2 different things, so clearly at some point they were separated. All right. All through this, one of the things that Egyptian myth does demonstrate is the attempt to impose some kind of order on chaos. And so all the way through Egyptian myth traditions, you have a struggle between order and chaos. The chaos being that primeval, watery sort of nothingness, and then order being starting to actually create particular things that we see in the world around us today. Plants, human beings, soil, air, sun. Right. There can be any number of causes, but the sun god leaves the earth, because of course the sun doesn't live on earth. We all know that, right? So the sun god leaves the earth in these stories. And then we have Osiris, who's probably the first name you may or may not be familiar with, but Osiris is an Egyptian god that many people have heard of. He was sort of the ruler god of Egypt, and he is murdered by his brother Seth. So we have Osiris and Seth. Seth murders Osiris. Osiris's wife and or sister, Isis, and their other wife and or sister, and again, it depends on the story whether all four of these characters are siblings or not, but there is Isis and Nephthys, and they are the two females in this group of four characters. They go searching for Osiris's body, because not only has Osiris been killed, but they can't find him. All right, so they go in search of his body, and some versions have both of them being married to Osiris. Some of them have Nephthys being married to Seth, Isis being married to Osiris. Lots of different versions, but we got these four characters, two male, two female. All right. They find Osiris. Isis revives him long enough to have him father her child. And the child's name is Horus, not H-O-R-A-C-E, but H-O-R-U-S. He was born in the reedy marshes, so in the wetlands. And chaos tries to sort of destroy Horus too and fails. Horus and Seth fight for control, and Horus wins. So now we've got Horus being the sort of world god in charge of everything. He becomes the ruler of the living. His father, having died again because Isis only revives him temporarily, is now the lord of the underworld. And here's another myth you could add about ancient Egyptian culture. We like to think when we see all those tombs and mummies and pyramids with all the stuff in them, the Egyptians were obsessed with death. But if you look at these stories, it really seems like Egyptians are more obsessed with this idea of rebirth. The sun sets in the west every day. And so cemeteries on the western bank of the Nile, the sun rises in the east, temples, celebration of life. So yes, there were things needed for the world of the dead, but there was always this sense of the coming back, the rebirth. Eventually, the creator god kind of grows weary of the world and retreats back into the ocean because, of course, as people are creating these stories, there aren't gods roaming the earth with them. So they have to sort of explain their absence, and there are many, many ways in which that happens. All right. There are many other gods, but those are the major players. And there's a group of 8 or 9 of them that figure very prominently in a creation myth for the Egyptians. And as I said earlier, unlike the Greeks, the Egyptians didn't really assign particular identities to their gods. And what I'm going to do now is read to you a translation of an Egyptian myth, and then we can sort of open up and just talk about it and what it might mean and what it probably doesn't mean, and see where we go. Okay, it's about 3 or 4 pages long. This one dates from about 2400 BC. And in my book, which I probably should have made some photocopies of, there is all the hieroglyphics and symbols and then an English translation underneath. Okay. There are several different words for the god, but the primary one that this text uses is Atum. The words of Nebuchadnezzar, he spake after he had come into being. I am he who came into being in the form of Khepera. I was the creator of what came into being. All right, so I came into being. I am the creator of what came into being. The creator of what came into being, all. After my coming into being, many things which came into being, coming forth from my mouth. Now here's where we start to get into the ambiguity. Beings came from his mouth. Did he speak them? Did he regurgitate them? How did they come out of his mouth? Not existed heaven, not existed earth, not had been created the things of the earth, plants, and creeping things, in place that. And this is a fairly literal kind of translation, so it's awkward. I raised them up from out of noon, that primeval water, from a state of inactivity. Right, so our Creator God is bringing things out of that water. Not found I a place I could stand wherein. I started reading this translation again recently. It sounds to me a lot like Yoda for some reason. So putting verbs in strange places. I worked a charm upon my heart. I laid a foundation in Ma, which is this order. I made attribute every. I was alone. Not had I spit in the form of Shu, not I had admitted in the form of Tefnut. And Shu and Tefnut are those two sisters that existed really early on. Not existed another who worked with me. All right. So when he is beginning the creation, Shu and Tefnut do not yet exist, nor was there any other god. It was just the one. I made a foundation in my heart, my own. There came into being the multitudes of things which came into being of the things which came into being, from out of the things which came into being of births. All right. So are we implying a chain of creation here, or are we just repeating for emphasis? From out of the things which came into being of their births. And my apologies to any of you with sensitivity to human things here. Even I, had union with my clenched hand. I joined myself in an embrace. All right, so we have essentially this myth telling a story of human creation by a male with no woman involved. All right. With my shadow, I poured seed into my mouth, my own, and by seed here he is referring to human seed, so his semen, into my mouth, and sent forth issue in the form of Shu. I sent forth moisture in the form of Tefnut. So this is how, according to this version, Shu and Tefnut, those two very early figures, were created. All right. Saith my father knew, they make to be weak my eye behind them, because for double periods they proceeded from me. I became God, one God's three. So here we have a creator God, Shu, and Tefnut, implying that there's some kind of a trinity relationship. That is from out of myself, and after I came into being in this earth, were raised up, therefore, Shu and Tefnut, in the inert watery mass wherein they were. Brought they to me, my eye in their train. After, therefore, I had united my members, I wept over them, and came into being men and women. Okay? The return of the eye, or the return of something that's been taken to him. He's weeping, creating human beings. Came into being men and women from tears which came forth from my eye. It raged against me after it came, and found that I had made another in its place. I endowed it with the power which I had made. Having made to approach, therefore, its place in my face, afterward, therefore, it ruleth earth this to its whole extent. Fall their seasons upon their plants. I endowed it with what it hath taken possession of in it. I came forth from the plants, creeping things all, and things which came into being, all in them. Give birth, Shu and Tefnut, Geb and Nut, give birth, Geb and Nut, to Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, Nephthys from the womb, one after the other of them. They give birth, they multiply, in earth this. Okay. So that's a version from 4,500 years ago, of a creation story in Egypt. So what do we know? What can we conclude from this? There are lots of ways to interpret myths. Many of you are studying this as part of your class, I'm assuming. And sometimes we look at them in ways of, is this just an explanation of where we came from? Are there values being communicated here? Are there geographic implications? There certainly are geographic implications to many myths, and Egyptian myths are not alone in this. There's a lot of mention of liquid and of water, both the primeval ocean and also the tears and other kinds of liquids. And in ancient Egypt, the Nile flooded annually, and it was a very different country than it is today. Right? It wasn't a vast desert. And so there was a need to, I think, explain some of these things and how the Nile came to flood and how that was a good thing. I mean, that was what fertilized the soil, and that is what allowed them to have an agricultural community. But then there are other Egyptian myths that start talking about deserts, because as the desert starts to encroach more and more, there's more discussion of that and what that means. And sometimes those two forces are pitted against each other, as you might expect. So would, an Egyptian in 2500 BC really believed this letter for letter? It's a kind of strange story, if you think about it. And we've got a God speaking, we've got a God essentially masturbating other beings into existence. We have a God that's planting seeds, both human and vegetable. All of these things are going on almost simultaneously in the story because people know that that's where creation comes from, but do they believe this? Probably not. It's probably more kind of speculation and metaphor, but what it actually represents, I think, is difficult to determine. When I look at Egyptian myth, I always have way more questions than I do answers, and that's what makes it interesting. But I think I'm going to just stop here. I'm not going to guarantee that I can answer a whole lot of questions, but I just wanted to introduce you to some of the stories that we see in ancient Egypt and how you can sort of think to yourselves about how they compare to other ones you've heard in other cultures. Thank you.
Thank you. Now you can imagine how her children, when they were young, went to sleep with the story before bedtime. And you said, "Mommy, say again, Mommy, say again." I wonder how many of you would love her to continue talking and talking.
There are other stories I can tell much better than this one. But
well, questions and comments. Yes.
I would really like to hear from Dr. Patterson, who does know way more about ancient Egypt than I do. But that's okay.
But I actually do have a question. In the myth that you just read, does the book say what the context was where this inscription was found?
It
I
is.
have a reason for asking this. So.
I want to say it was. No, it's not telling me here. Okay. I can probably find that out, though.
Well, the reason I asked, now you said around 2400, so that's late 4th dynasty, early 5th dynasty.
Right.
And the reason I ask is, although in certainly Egyptian myths, most myths, develop organically and so on, in the case of Egypt, so many of the myths that we have in the context of funerary complexes, royal complexes, things like that. A lot of the myths that we get were shaped by royal ideology.
Right.
These pharaohs and others, and many nobles and so on, use these myths to project certain ideas. Mm-hmm. I guess if there's one word that is most fundamentally important to all of these, it's Maat, M-A-A-T,
right.
The concept of orderliness that derives from the regularity of the Nile. So I know that in terms of how to interpret some of the strange imagery in that, as you say, it's kind of hard to do that. But certainly sometimes what you get with this imagery, very vivid imagery, you get it in the context of a ritual. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it'll be a royal ritual reinforcing the pharaoh's divinity or the pharaoh's authority or the pharaoh's legitimacy and so on. And this imagery of life-giving, this imagery of renewal and so on, expressed in very vivid ways, is going to be part of that ritual that will have a very strong visual component in the ritual, and then later in the tomb or in the temple, the funerary temple, where, and of course most people won't see that imagery in those contexts. Most people will have to go somewhere else, but so much of what survives, because it was hidden away, is what we get, and that's this very vibrant visual feast that is often what punctuates or what tells these stories. So a lot of it is driven by a sort of I don't want to say political, because it's not just political, it's a combination political, religious, social, and so on, all kinds of factors working together. As you say, the Egyptians were very, very, maybe they still are, but certainly the ancient Egyptians were very, very complicated people. There's nothing simple about anything they did, nothing.
Right.
And there's all these different interlacing things going on in terms of how myth relates to politics and religion.
Well, and that's
so on.
actually, I neglected to say, one of the reasons that I thought it was a good idea to open with Ovid is when Ovid is telling or retelling those Greek myths, he's doing it under the context of the Emperor Augustus. And there you've actually got some talk back to Augustus. It's more not what Augustus perceives as what Ovid is kind of thrown in his face, I think, a lot. And here you do get that more of the opposite, that just as a creator, I hesitate to use the word God because it is very different, but a creator being giving order to the world just as, our leaders give order to our civilization, our society. And so I think there is definitely some holdover there. I don't know enough about Egyptian history, and I wasn't too clear exactly where this particular version came from, which is one of the reasons I didn't go there. But the other thing that you brought up that I think is really important to keep in mind about any myths anywhere is the connection between myth and ritual. Some people see them as the same thing. Other cultures, you really have more of a verbal storytelling piece and less of the ritual piece, but they are innately connected to each other. And a great example in Judeo-Christian culture, of course, is a Catholic Mass, where there are certain actions that are always performed the same way, either before or after the telling of the passages from the Bible. And so there are all of these connections between action and words. And in some cultures, look at the ancient Mayans and Aztecs, there's human sacrifice going on, and then stories being told alongside that. And every culture sort of puts those two things together in different ways. But you're right, the ancient Egyptian cultures, we have enough evidence to show that they were highly ritualistic in many regards, particularly around death and funerary rites, and then this sort of celebration of the day and the resurrection of one kind or another.
Other questions or comments? This is your time. I have a question for you regarding the history of the myths. Mm-hmm. You mentioned something about the myths connected or tied to gods or goddesses. Do we have any light? Which came first? Did they have the god first and then created this myth around them, or the myths just happened and this deified thing?
My own take on this, and I think what a lot of scholars will argue, is that the myths, the stories, create the gods and not the gods creating the stories. That all myths harken back to a day supposedly when human beings and gods interacted in one way or another. But they're all written and told by human beings after the god has departed the earth or the culture or the area. And so what's happening is people are telling stories, and they're creating stories in which they frankly are inventing a god. Now I think you can, if one is a person of faith, one can read back into that God inspires these stories in one way or another. But because we have so many different stories with different god figures in different cultures, it's really hard to determine that. Yeah. And when we talk about story, And the reason I talked about myths being about gods, and that line isn't real clear either, but typically myths are more about gods, legends are more about heroes, and then tales are more like, our fairy tales that no one believes are true. It's just a fanciful story. And so when we study them in folklore, we tend to divide them in those three categories. Folklorists love to classify things, and so we we do that with abandon. Yes, exactly.
Any other questions? I have another question if anybody doesn't have, so I'll jump here. When you look into the myths of Egypt and other cultures, you find themes kind of reoccurring.
Mm-hmm.
For example, dark and light, or
Right.
dualism or something, good and bad,
Mm-hmm.
good cop, bad cop, something like that.
Right.
How would you account for this? How all these cultures have these common threads with different...
Some theorists will take a psychological approach. Jung would say that it's something embedded in a human psyche, that we think in binary terms, and therefore we're going to get contrasting pairs in any set of myths. Light and dark, some people will again take the natural explanation, and just because we have day and night, we are going to have light and dark as a primary one of those binary oppositions. Myth, just like any other academic area, there have been several succeeding theories that attempt to explain it. Everything from the simple, it's just a story to explain who we are, to it has something to do with the sort of inner machinations of the brain. A good example of this, I'm going to take us away from Egypt for a minute, is Oedipus. Does the complex precede the story, or does the story just provide a nice label for a complex that says, the boy loves his mother and hates his father? Freud got a whole lot of mileage out of the myth of Oedipus. But why did anyone tell the story of Oedipus is a good question. I think it's actually a story that has a whole lot more to do with fate and free will than it does with boys loving their mothers. But that question, I think, persists. I'm not going to have a good answer for any of your questions.
The answers are...
like any good scholar.
We are here to raise questions. Any other questions? Yes.
Towards the end, when you were talking, you mentioned about, do we think the Egyptians really believed everything that you just mentioned? And I was just thinking, well, I think there may be different levels. Because I was thinking, like today, jump from ancient Egypt to here, is there's a lot of people in America now who believe every single word that the Bible says.
Right.
But then there's others who believe, like, well, there's some stories that help explain things, how we should act, how we should believe.
Right.
I'm wondering, maybe that's what a lot of Egyptians were. Some literally believed it, and some maybe none, and then there's the middle ground.
Louder, please.
Okay. Oh.
Well, he's talking about the diversity of opinions. We can't say one way or the other that the Egyptians just absolutely did believe or absolutely didn't believe. There were probably some who did believe them literally word for word, and others that saw them as completely symbolic, and there's probably a lot of people in the middle that saw things. I mean, I keep hearkening back, and this is my apologies for this, is because I'm in the midst of teaching Roman and Greek mythology right now, but the Greeks, I mean, you have a god of love. I mean, to what extent is that just explaining that love is this uncontrollable force that we really can't get a grip on? It can make our lives miserable. It can also make them wonderful. But do we believe that there's really a little naked baby with wings and a bow and arrow out there? I would argue that most people probably didn't believe in that being per se. But somebody came up with the story. So, but I think you're right. There's gradations of belief here.
My question's going to go further away from what you were saying, but you mentioned that in general, the Egyptian gods, in contrast to the Greeks and Romans, were not identified with a single element. But what about Ra? Where does he fit in?
Well, and
I've always thought of him as the sun
sun
god.
Would you please repeat the question?
Okay. She asked about the god Ra being equated with the sun. And isn't that one that is consistent? I would say it's consistent over time, but I think it's also that Ra was seen as being broader than just the sun. So not a sun god in that you point up there and say that's Ra, but that is part of Ra's total being. He was a much broader kind of creator by that point.
Other questions? Yes.
I know that some of the cradles of civilization, the different civilizations have had mythology about, I think it's the Epic of Gilgamesh or like Noah's Ark. I was just curious, did the ancient Egyptians, did they have something in their history and their mythology that about a family surviving on a boat when the world was flooded?
Thank you.
I don't know the full corpus of Egyptian mythology, but I will say that almost every culture has a flood myth, with the exception of most cultures in Africa. All right. Now, when I talk about this in my myth and culture class, I make the argument it's because, and this doesn't apply to Egypt, but it certainly applies to sub-Saharan Africa, it doesn't flood in sub-Saharan Africa. Egypt uses the concept of flooding very deliberately in their stories because the Nile flooded every year, but there was not, I don't think, a story of a cataclysmic flood that wipes out the entire earth the way other cultures have.
Okay.
Unless, am I missing one, or I don't know?
No. Can I respond to that? No, I think you're right. I don't know of any either, and I think the reason for that is that, to simplify it, the thing about Ma'at is that the relationship between humans and the divine was generally a very positive relationship, in large part because the Nile was so regular. If you look at it over 4,000 years, that it comes away with a very positive, you come away with that. Whereas Mesopotamia, life was very precarious. The Tigris and Euphrates were not as reliable as the Nile. They weren't as consistent, and you get myths where you have the gods smiting humanity, and so then either a flood or whatever, then we'll build a boat, and then there'll be a favored few. So Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Noah, or Deucalion in the Greek world, and so on, which is clearly an import because no flooding in Greece really. But so in those societies where there's a need for that sort of story of an ark, something like that, or in the case of the Hebrews, an ark where, well, let's put it this way. In those societies where you have that kind of story, there's usually a need to explain the relationship between the humanity and the divine. So in the case of the Hebrews, there's a covenant that's involved. You don't get that in the others, but you do it in the Hebrew world. You don't really need that in the Egyptian world, as far as I can tell. I'm not an expert either, by any means, but because I'm a Greek and Roman person. But still, I don't think that the Egyptians needed that kind of a story, and that's why I don't think we have it in there.
And there wasn't that sense, and the one thing that they did really deify was the sun, and that is absolutely regular. I mean, the sun never betrays us, except occasionally when there's an eclipse, and then the story will come up about that. But it's not, Egypt didn't have the same kinds of weather issues and sort of geological issues that some of the other places in the world had.
Another question, if you don't have. We understand why they worship the sun, because it's strong and has light and other stuff and heat. Why should they worship cats or animals or something like that?
I mean, the way I look at that is those types of stories and myths I do see as more metaphoric. It's more worshiping the characteristics of certain animals. One of the major gods is Sobek Ra, which is a combination of the sun and a crocodile. But the crocodile piece, I mean, is seen as being very strong, right? Lives in the water, but is not just strong, but is fierce. And so there are certain characteristics there. And I prefer to see most animal roles in myth more in that way, not that they necessarily would believe that the cat itself was a god, but that there were certain characteristics about cats that they found, maybe they saw intelligence there, or the fleet of foot, or something.
Or incarnation of the god in the image of this creature, so they say it's a god in this image.
Right. And the other thing that I didn't go into is when you start looking at gods, there are major gods, and then there are all these demigods, and then there are personal gods. Each, just as the ancient Romans, there are household gods and village patrons, and it's hard to use that word God to explain all these different things. But there were these sort of supernatural spirit things that were respected and sometimes feared in any number of pieces of creation, in Egyptian culture and in many others.
I know we have to go to a 2 o'clock meeting or something or class, so we'll give you some time to do that. One more question if you have. If you don't, I have. Do you, this is a chance. Now, do you have in your readings find any trace of a Darwinian evolution trace in that back then that says the creator, the creation happened by itself and gradually did by natural selection, but always you have a God image in all these stories that's fluids or some way it was a person who brought creation to existence. I think that was common in all cultures. Is there any stories that says nothing was and then after a while it became?
There are some, but there almost always is some kind of intermediary in these stories. I mean, they all start with water, almost all of them, and then we get land. Sometimes there's a person that brings the land, sometimes the land emerges, but there's generally a human-like agent at some point early in the story.
Someone wrote an article about back 5,000 years ago until the 20th century or 19th century when Darwin started to say nothing. The human nature, or you said embedded, said that there is a supreme power. There is a superpower that something must be done by somebody. Somebody must do something. Except in the late 19th century and then 20th century and 21st century when people started to say, no, it just happened by themselves and just happened. So over a long time. But all history, they always have a figure, a person who did something.
And I think just as that impression starts, and I'm not going to say it's going to decline because there are a lot of people who still believe in that very strongly, we also have the rise of science and more sort of tangible explanations for things. And I think that causes that.
I mean, even science would tell us that in every action is done by something.
Okay.
So scientifically speaking, there must be a person. But science today, in part thereof, would say, no, except this happened by itself. So it's kind of frustrating. Well, 2 o'clock is approaching, and
we're never going to answer that question today, are we?
Please to give her a round of applause, big one.